Hare Krishna, everybody. This is acyuta-bhava, and today we are going to be taking another question from the audience about Bhakti. This question today is a really deep question, and I'm going to give my response from Srila Prabhupada, who is my guru's guru, who brought Bhakti over to the West in the 1960s. So I'll kind of be, I'll be phoning a friend today. So the question is, what is evil? What is evil? Context: I'm reading about Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas on evil and wondering about crossovers with Vedanta. Well, first of all, that's a big project. So good luck with that. These are vast topics, and there's a lot in common between Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Vedanta, first of all. And I highly recommend, for a good study on the crossover, there's a book by Thomas McKivley called The Shape of Ancient Thought, one of my favorite books of all time. If you've been around my work long enough, you know I refer to it a lot. Anyway, the subtext says you do cover ideas about evil in a previous talk, but that was specifically about God's presence in evil. I'm now wondering more about what makes something evil. For example, I'm reading about the idea of evil being the lack of good, what is furthest away from God. Like there's a sliding scale, and anything with a form can partake in evil because we have the choice to turn away from good or God. So my question is, what is evil according to the Bhakti tradition, or what makes something evil if it even can be? Okay. So, as promised, for that, I'm going to phone a friend and read what Srila Prabhupada said one time as he was gaining popularity and would take flights from one place to another to visit his students and disciples around the US and the world in the countercultural movement of the 60s. One time he was on a plane, and the pilot came, or it was a flight supervisor came and sat down next to him and asked him if he could ask some questions. And Swami Prabhupada said, yes. So this is the conversation. Is everything created by God? Asks the flight supervisor. Srila Prabhupada said, yes, and quoted the Vedanta Sutra, Janmari Ashayata. Everything in existence, Prabhupada said, has its origin in God. Then what is evil? The flight supervisor asked. Is evil also God's creation? For God, there is not good or evil, Prabhupada explained. Everything is good. Goodness is God's frontage, and evil is God's back portion. Taking this example, the chest or the back of the body are equal. It's not that when there is some pain in the backside, I don't care for it. I simply take care of it when there is pain in the chest. No, although it is the backside, it is as important as the front side. So you're saying evil and good are of the same importance? No. For God, there is nothing evil. Just like the sun, for the sun, there is no darkness. But for us, there is light and darkness. If you keep your back to the sun, you will find darkness. And if you face the sun, then there is no darkness. We create darkness as soon as we change our position. If instead of remaining in front of God, I keep God on the back, then there is darkness. Otherwise, there is no question of darkness. But in the sun, as it is, there is no such darkness. Therefore, God is all good. But for us, when we forget God, that is evil. And when we are in God consciousness always, then everything is good. Is that all right? So a really, really beautiful conversation. And I would recommend even listening, like rewinding and listening to that quote again a few times and really letting it sink in. Here's the best way that I've come to understand that. I'll try my best now at just repackaging that in my own words, which I have to do for myself when I read things to better understand it. And then articulating it to other people is always how we learn even more. So, and anyone out there who studies Bhakti, please feel free to also help explain this text as you've understood it, because it's a pretty famous one that a lot of devotees in Bhakti are well aware of. At any rate, so there's in the analogy or the kind of visual metaphor that Prabhupada uses, he says that there's a front side and a back side to God. Now, from God's point of view, God doesn't, like the sun, God does not see darkness or evil. God let me just read the exact quote. He said, "For God there is nothing evil, just like for the sun there is no darkness." Now, but for us, we're made as beings who have a choice. to participate in that God nature within ourselves and in relationship with that divine source. When we do, we too learn to see beyond the dualities of desire and hate, good and evil, right and wrong. All the dualities of the world are resolved in Krishna consciousness. They're resolved in God consciousness, and we only see the good in all dualities, all apparent dualities. We start to see them as the they all become the evidence of God's goodness, of God's love, of God's mercy, of God's tolerance, of God's grace, of God's compassion, of God's play, of God's laughter. We start to see in the dualities God, and so it is all good. But if we turn our consciousness from God, we turn away from God and face the other direction, so to speak, then we experience darkness. And this world is a world that is said to be created literally for the purpose of beings who wish to turn away from God, to experience like the shadow aspect of God, or this idea of God as having a light and a dark side, or a front and a back side, so to speak. And this is an illusory conception. That's why it's called Maya. And yet it is still divine. So it's an illusion. There is really no good or evil. There's just the light of God. But we can make a choice to experience the illusion that it is otherwise, and that's what this world is. When it's only when we're in the material conception of life, that is the material conception of consciousness, then we experience the duality. And from that standpoint, though, right? What is that duality doing for us? Well, because it's inherently an illusion, and because the soul's nature is a part of that light of God, then there, at every step of the way, when we engage with the evil or darkness of the world, or the dualities of good and bad in the world, we're always being given this choice that's being put back to us to say, can you see God in it? Right? Can you come back to the light? Don't you see God? And when we do, then we face God again from within this world, which is what spiritual life and the practice of bhakti is doing. Then at that moment, the distinctions collapse and we start to see as God sees. We see from the same like effulgent light of the sun that is self same within our own hearts, that the luminous spark of the soul. We see through that light, and then the distinctions collapse. So the distinction between good and bad is both real and unreal in a sense. There's a sense in which it is a real part of a world and an experience that we have when we turn away from God. And it seems like a paradox, right? It seems like it feels like a bit of a paradox, because it seems like we're saying God is all good, and yet there's no distinction between good and evil. So it's kind of confusing. But again, the simplest way to think about it is, when we choose to engage in this world, we engage with an illusory experience that there is something other than goodness. And then we feel that there's a juxtaposition between good and bad. That illusion is facilitated from God through God's illusory energy, which is called Maya. When that Maya energy covers us, then we see only in terms of these distinctions, and God is good, and this evil, well, it must be something other than God, right? But when we start to see, especially when we see within the darkness the light, within the darkness of our own faults and flaws, we forgive. Within the darkness of the world, we find compassion. When we learn to see light in the dark, then we start coming back home to God. And we do that by training our eyes, by training our hearts, by singing the names of God, by chanting, talking about God, by bringing our attention back to God. Then we start illuminating within the darkness. We get a little halo around our heads, so to speak. And then we start walking home. And when we do, we come to find out that there has never, ever been anything but this goodness, and that we were asleep. We were in an illusion. And that illusion, Maya, is not itself evil. It's actually divine. It's actually good. In fact, Maya is a servant of God that is facilitating the slumbering fantasies of these beings who have used their free will to turn away from God. And in that sense, Maya is actually good. Maya is a servant who's helping people to facilitate these illusory desires, so that love may deepen and so that the soul may come back home. So I know that's a deep answer, but that's the one that's given to us in the Shastras from the Vedic tradition, especially through the Gita and the Bhagavat Purana. And that's my just repackaging of it. Um, and I'm doing this kind of fast and loose, like a real deep treatment. I'd lay out, a lot of supporting scriptures and things like that. And that's more formally appropriate to do with such a deep question. But I'm trying to keep it more conversational. And I personally feel like sometimes it's a bummer if you start laying out too many scriptures, but that's the gist of it, as best as I've understood. So anyone who's listening, if you would like to articulate more than what I've said, that you come from the Bhakti tradition, you want to help me with the explanation in the chat box, obviously, as always, I really appreciate it. So that's what I've got. Really good questions you guys are asking. So thanks, and keep them coming. You can always email info@nightlightastrology.com, put Bhakti question in the subject line. All right, that's what I've got. Take it easy, everyone. Hare Krishna.